This episode is scripted, narrated, recorded and edited by John Ruth and Newell Fisher. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 54. Well, we did it. We went through the entire 1972 novel in detail, taking just short of a year. I'm not claiming for a moment that our analysis of the book was perfect. I'm certain it wasn't, and that its shortcomings will become apparent as time passes. But it is a complete detailed account of the book, and therefore a resource we are very proud of. It was done very much on the fly, as it were, and the methods used had to evolve rapidly over the last year. About halfway through that year, having started out never having podcasted ever before, I hit one of the largest crises of my adult life, having to move in with my parents, with my wife, to become their carers, and this podcast was only able to remain weekly as a result of John Ruth's extensive assistance with the script. And when I say extensive, I mean that he has written most of the words you have heard me say on the podcast since episode 33, The Great River. I really cannot express my gratitude to John enough, and hope to become more active in scripting from this point forward. He probably needs a rest. This effectively is the first episode of Season 2 of this podcast. Our platform, Anchor by Spotify, does allow episodes to be categorised in seasons, but I prefer to maintain a single number run for the episodes as it just sounds better. And who wouldn't want to get to episode 100? So what happens now? Well, my plan is very close to the one I set out in episode 1. I plan to pause for 4 episodes now we have finished the book, rather than the 2 I paused for between each part of the book. Then we will embark on a detailed analysis of the 1978 film version, which I plan to take approximately 20 episodes. After that, following the chronological order of versions of Watership Down, we will go through the sequel, Tales from Watership Down, published in 1996. This should also take about 20 episodes. After that, I plan to embark on an analysis of the 1999 TV series. This should take about 40 episodes. And that's about as far as I'm planning ahead in any detail, about 80 episodes, about a year and a half's worth. After that, I plan to look at the 2018 Netflix version, and then there is the graphic novel that comes out later this year. After that, who knows? Of course, there will be occasional episodes on other themes in Watership Down along the way, and I really want to get back to the site visits, which had to stop following recent events. But it may well be that this podcast ultimately has a limited shelf life as an ongoing current podcast rather than an archive. If so, so be it. I do severely doubt that it could keep going just on the basis of themed episodes, and I have decided that Watership Down will very much remain the focus. However, should another version of Watership Down come out at any point, then that would obviously be fuel for continuing or restarting this podcast. I'm very much open to any and all ideas regarding the above, and always happy to receive scripts or sound files for inclusion in an episode, for which full credit and Owsler membership will obviously be given. You can email me at the Watership Down podcast, that's all one word, all lowercase, at outlook.com. Other ways of getting in touch are included in the podcast summary on your platform of choice. So, from this point on, the bulk of this podcast is about portrayals and developments of the story of the original novel. In June 2021, I recorded a podcast section that is very relevant to this change of gear in the podcast, which we will hear later. First, though, my fellow scriptwriter John Ruth addresses the question, is Watership Down an allegory?
Hello there, this is John Ruth, and I wanted to take a little bit of time and go over one particular Watership Down question that I've always found kind of interesting, and that question is Watership Down an allegory? And I think the simple answer is no, it is not. Like Lord of the Rings, sometimes people think that it is. In an actual allegory, the characters, places, and even events typically represent some sort of unique, or not necessarily unique, but significant meaning with either moral or political significance. There's a George Orwell book called Animal Farm that I'm sure you all have heard of. Animal Farm is a great example of a political allegory, specifically the events leading up to and the Russian Revolution and the events that follow. The characters in Animal Farm sometimes represent real people. At other times they represent a particular part of society or a certain class of people. And some of the places in Animal Farm represent European nations. So that's a good example of that. Now, Watership Down, I think it gets accused of being an allegory quite a bit. Again, so does Lord of the Rings. And I think that both authors, Richard Adams and J.R. Tolkien, claim that their work was not allegorical, and I happen to agree with them. It's not. Although if you compare Watership Down and Lord of the Rings, I would say Watership Down is more allegory-like than Lord of the Rings. And it's simply because the characters tend to be more archetypal. Many of them are personifications of a particular thing or a particular trait. We get characters that represent very basic character types. Okay, so let's go over a few of these. And I think we'll start with Hazel. Hazel, you might say, is leadership personified. Now, he doesn't necessarily have all of what you might consider to be typical leader tropes. We know that he's not the biggest or the strongest, and he's not the smartest. He is smart, but in another kind of way. He's not the same kind of smart that, say, Blackberry is. We know that at the beginning of Watership Down, Fiver makes a remark that Hazel is likely to get into the Sandalford Warren Ausla eventually. But, of course, he never gets a chance because they clear out of Sandalford Warren before that happens. And Hazel is also not a perfect character. So if you compare Hazel to, say, a character like Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, that is very close to a perfect character. Hazel definitely has his flaws, and we see these play out throughout Watership Down. He pays for his forays to Nuthanger Farm with a permanent injury. He's not the fighter that Bigwig and Silver are. He's not as smart as Blackberry or even Fiver. However, he's possessed with some things that make him highly successful in Watership Down, and there are two things that really stand out to me. The first is that Hazel has a great deal of what we now refer to as emotional intelligence. He understands how to take the feelings of others into his equations. These often prove to be important, although sometimes they're just under the surface. They're not something that is immediately evident. The second thing is that Hazel knows how to delegate. He asks others to do things. And you have to ask yourself, would Hazel have succeeded inside of Ephrafa the same way that Bigwig did? I would say that he wouldn't have. Did Hazel devise the plan to go to Ephrafa in the first place? And no, he didn't. Blackberry did. Hazel came up with the conditions that the plan needed to work. And then he assigned it to a rabbit who he knew could get it done. And, of course, that was Blackberry. So what comes out of all this is that Hazel is a very effective leader. Okay, so I've talked about Hazel quite a bit, and clearly he's my favorite character. But anyway, let's move on and talk about Fiver. Fiver is another somewhat archetypal character in that Fiver is the seer or the visionary among all the rabbits. And without his initial vision, there would have never been a reason for the small band of rabbits to leave Sandalford in the first place. If they hadn't done that, they would have most likely been killed when the Sandalford Warren was wiped out. So, and as far as we know, only Holly and Bluebell were the only rabbits to get away from Sandalford Warren that lived to tell the tale. And so Fiver's vision kind of saves, that initial band that leaves Sandalford. However, his visions don't just go away then. They continue throughout the book, and they continue to pay off for our group of rabbits. And that group of rabbits, of course, eventually grows into a successful warren. So Fiver is also highly intelligent on his own, but he made it a point to have another rabbit that was even smarter from a purely intelligence perspective. All right, so let's talk about Bigwig now. Bigwig, you might say, is the personification of strength. He represents brute strength, and I'd also say he represents tenacity. He's not only the best fighter among the Watership Down rabbits, he's really the best fighter in the entire novel. He demonstrates his strength on many occasions in the book, and he has this never-give-up attitude. And again, I'd use the word tenacity to describe that. The shining wire that could have killed him at Cowslip's Warren did not. He succeeded in Ephrafa as a spy. That was a nearly impossible mission. And he was critically important later on in defeating Ephrafa by outfighting General Woundwort. So he's an amazing rabbit. He's big, he's strong, he's a proven fighter. And along with Silver and Buckthorn, Bigwig leads and rounds out the Ausla that existed even when our rabbits were just wandering around and looking for a place to live. All right, so let's talk about Dandelion. Dandelion represents two things, and I've always found a certain charm in this. Of course, we know that Dandelion is the fastest rabbit, so you could say that he represents speed personified, but he's also the bard of our band of rabbits, and I think this is his most important role. Being the bard for a band of rabbits, or being the bard for anybody, the storyteller, when you don't have any type of written language, is very important. That's how your history and your legends get paid forward and get told to future generations. So he's not the only storyteller, of course, among our rabbits, but he's probably the rabbit that's the best at, and we get more of his storytelling in Watership Down. So speaking of storytellers, let's move on and talk about Bluebell. So Bluebell is the other rabbit at Watership Down who is known to be able to spin a good story. But Bluebell also has another capability, and we also know that he is somewhat of a jokester, and being a jokester is what saved Holly when Holly escaped from Sandalford. So being the jokester creates another type of archetypal character that we commonly call the jester. All right, and let's go to a rabbit now that I've mentioned a couple times already, and that's Blackberry. Blackberry is very much intelligence personified. He's clearly the smartest. He can conceptualize things that no other rabbit can. He's amazingly intelligent. He's the one that comes up with the plan to get the does out of Ephrathah, and it works. And the last character I want to talk about is Kihar. So not so much of an archetypal character, I would say, but maybe more of a character trope, in that I think Kihar represents what we might think of as the exotic and knowledgeable foreigner. So just some comments from me on Watership Down and why I think it's not an allegory.
Thank you, John. Interesting food for thought on the nature of allegory, and a satisfying character summary after finishing the book. And now the section on originalism and revisionism from episode 14 that I recorded in early June last year, 2021. Although it is a bit out of date now, it is worth another listen. Originalism and revisionism. I recently ran a poll on the two Watership Down fans groups on Facebook in which I asked, what is your interest in Watership Down primarily based upon? I gave two options, though others can be added. They were the original book and the 1978 film. On the large group, the results are currently 71 for the book and 25 for the film. On the smaller group, this was 21 book and 15 film, with one added vote for the Tales from Watership Down audiobook. Why do I mention this? Well, one day I will finish going through the original book and will embark upon a discussion of the portrayals of the book and on film and TV. At that point, I'm going to have to address the tension between the originalist approach to the story and the revisionist approach. Basically, this is the tension between the view that the original book is canon and should never be changed in any portrayal of it, and the view that the original source material is there to be played with, changed and expanded. This is not just about summarising the story, which is unavoidable in any film portrayal of such a long novel, but about actual changes to the story. Having said that, summary that goes too far does effectively change the story. Here's where things could get ugly between those for whom their main devotion is the book and those for whom it is the film. The 1978 film, at a running time of 102 minutes, obviously had to summarise the story heavily. This is surely forgivable. However, it did not just summarise the story. There are places where it changed it, and examples of summary that effectively changed the story in a way that an originalist might criticise heavily. Yet the 1978 film, and its telling of the story, is much loved by many in its own right, independently of the original book. And this leads us to an awkward possibility that I'm going to introduce into the debate at this point. When it comes to Watership Down, there are actually two originalist positions. One treats the original book as canon in any analysis of subsequent versions. However, another treats the 1978 film as canon in any analysis of film or TV versions that came after it. In fact, I'll go even further. The addition of a female character to those who leave Sandalford in the film was, perhaps, an implied criticism of the sexism of the original book. Yes, I'm suggesting the possibility that the 1978 film may even have improved on the original story in some aspects. Shame she is killed off so early and has about one line. I'm going to introduce the idea that the 1978 film clearly has such a following in its own right that it has earned a canon status all of its own. I'm well aware that this may annoy devotees of the book, but it is so clearly the main reason for love of Watership Down in so many of its devotees that it is arguably pointless to deny it this status. When it comes to analysing the 1978 film, I do plan to fairly ruthlessly compare it to the original book, and will not hold back on criticising it from a book originalist perspective. However, the 1978 film set up conventions when it comes to telling the story on screen that subsequent versions have felt the need to acknowledge. For example, the opening of the story with a stylised version of the story of the blessing of Ella. Was this creative laziness, or just acknowledging the validity of the defining film portrayal of the story? In any case, my analysis of film and TV versions of the book is going to throw up some surprising examples of much-loved portrayals being ridiculously inaccurate, while far less admired versions get some very specific elements of the story surprisingly right. To this end, and very much for my own amusement, there will be a theme of crimes against Watership Down, specific charges including abuse of geology and geography. Coming across Ephrafa on the way to Watership Down from Sandalwood is an example of the latter that I regret to say the 1978 film is guilty of. This would involve a ridiculous journey on the part of Captain Holly, who in the original book journeys to Ephrafa, which lies in the complete opposite direction to Sandalwood, as an ambassador after settling in at the newly founded Watership Down Warren. Holly encountering Ephrafa on the way to Watership Down was summary of the story taken to a ridiculous extreme, and I find the 1978 film guilty as charged. As for geology, the 1999 TV series has too many offences to name, but they will be named. Watership Down is set mostly on chalk downland, which can be a bit devoid of certain features that make for an interesting cartoon, among them extensive cave networks and waterfalls. However, this is no excuse, at least from an originalist perspective, for such blatant abuse of geology, and the charge sheet will be long and detailed. But, as an interesting aside, the portrayal of the stories of El in the Canadian TV series are worthy of credit. It is the only version that includes more than one of them, and their stylisation is based upon the rabbit art shapes of the Warren of the Snares, the showing of which to Hazel also features in the story. Let me sum the above up as follows. There is no version of Watership Down, including the original book, that should be free from criticism or from praise. I will respect originalist perspectives completely, but I will also give a full and fair hearing to any revisionist portrayals of the story. Even, and I say this through gritted teeth, the rabbit's trip to the seaside that features in the Canadian TV series. I'm not even joking. That actually happens. You can see how traumatic this is going to be at times, but I'm prepared to take one for the team. Next time, given that we have just passed International Women's Day, we look at the does of Watership Down.